I'm Friedlin Wagner. I want to invite you to join me in a tremendous musical adventure. At the same time, it is a great historic moment in television because my grandfather's Der Ring des Nibelungen was filmed in its entirety for the first time in its history. It was filmed right here in the theater Wagner built to accommodate his mammoth 4 music dramas of The Ring.
Early in the summer of 1980, Richard Wagner's renowned festival house in Bayreuth, West Germany, was invaded by nearly 100 sound and video technicians. They erected metal lighting towers, installed miles of cable and wiring, and removed rows of seats from the century-old theater to provide space for television cameras. This was the beginning of one of the most ambitious and expensive undertakings in the history of music on television. During the months ahead, complete performances of Wagner's 4-part operatic cycle, The Ring of the Nibelungen, would be videotaped. The production was the controversial one created for Bayreuth's centennial by stage director Patrice Chéreau and conductor Pierre Boulez. During these telecasts, more people will see and hear The Ring than ever before in its history. The television director for the Ring project was Brian Large, who had pioneered the filming of Wagner's operas for television.
people are afraid of this piece. It's 14 hours long. It takes 4 nights to go to it here. But what we've tried to do is to break down the barriers, to communicate with people, to make them realize that this is a piece of human drama, a saga which they can relate to through human feelings. The freshness of Chéreau's ideas and the freshness of Boulez's conducting brings the whole thing into a new perspective by treating it as music theatre, television music theatre. To make the ring for the first time and to do it in Bayreuth, it's the only place. It had to be here. The vibrations of Wagner, his house, Wagner's grandson being here, organizing everything. The omens were right. And I hope the whole thing will take on a new vista and win new converts for the ring.
The first ring for television was recorded in the theater Richard Wagner designed specifically to present the cycle. Its cornerstone was laid by the composer in 1872, outside of the small town of Bayreuth. Ever since, there has always been a Wagner on this green hill to direct the festival, create productions, and guard the heritage of what has become one of the world's most important musical shrines. Wolfgang Wagner, the composer's grandson, has ruled Bayreuth single-handedly since the death of his brother Wieland in 1966. Wolfgang has produced 2 cycles of the ring himself, in 1960 and in 1970. It was he who engaged Chéreau to undertake the centennial production of the ring.
Was ganz Geheimes, gell? Haben Sie gehört, neues Gesellschaftsklatsch. Das Wesentliche der hiesigen Arbeit und die besondere Arbeitsatmosphäre hier besteht nach meiner Ansicht darin, erstens, dass man seine Kräfte misst an einem Werk von besonderer Geltung und Bedeutung. Es geht also hier bei den Bayreuther Festspielen nicht irgendeine Aufführung von irgendjemand zu machen, sondern es geht hier in dem Fall das Werk Richard Wagners auf die Bühne zu bringen, zu interpretieren, wie ich schon sagte, möglichst neu zu interpretieren und immer wieder andere Aspekte innerhalb der Deutung aufzureißen.
Patrice Chéreau was only 31 when Wolfgang Wagner invited him to Bayreuth. He had staged only 2 operas previously, one by Offenbach and one by Rossini. Engaging him for so important a project as the Centennial Ring was an enormous gamble. Chéreau had less than 4 months to produce the 4 operas which make up the ring. At first, he doubted it could be done.
Before I refused one time, I almost refused to do because the time was too short, I thought, and I thought it was impossible for me to do. I have not the force, the craft, the energy to do that. And then I tried to accept, to forget the short time, and I accept. And I discovered first when I saw the ring here, for example, in '75, that Wagner was always theater. It was not only opera, but always theater, always theatrical material, theatrical dramaturgy, and that was important because, and for example, during the rehearsals, the first rehearsals of '76, I had the impression that Wagner pushed me to do always theater and not opera.
A man of the theater, Chéreau began with the text. He did not know the music, having never seen the cycle until the summer of 1975, when he heard it in Bayreuth at the invitation of Wolfgang Wagner.
I tried first to read the story of the ring and to have a very simple approach in the way to tell the story, this story, so simple as possible for people. I think Wagner used, for example, the mythology to tell story and to give a point of view on his time, of the story of his time, of the politics of his time.
It was conductor and champion of the avant-garde Pierre Boulez who brought Chéreau, the enfant terrible of the French theater, to the attention of Wolfgang Wagner.
Well, you know, I am always very interested with theater and with the producers, and I have heard about him in France quite a lot, and then I saw productions by him, and I was totally convinced that if somebody has to do a production, it has to be somebody like that. You never know, you take a bet, so, I mean, you never know if things will be successful or not. I mean successful from an achievement point of view. I don't think first of the audience. But I mean, I was sure that's the kind of fresh blood that a theater producer will bring into the opera will be very good.
Like Chéreau, Boulez became the center of an enormous controversy. In his quest for detail and transparency in the music, he refined the sound of the orchestra, at times almost to chamber dimensions. The musicians, accustomed to making richer, thicker sounds, threatened a strike and formed a committee to ask Wolfgang Wagner to allow them to play out louder.
Well, my main goal was to get rid of what the so-called tradition, you know, which for me also is unbearable. I mean, what is tradition? So if you get to this point, so tradition is really mannerisms of somebody which are transmitted and transformed in worst mannerism because they have no raison d'être at this point. You know, everybody has his mannerism. I'm sure that I have my own mannerisms. But I don't ask anybody to imitate me. And therefore, if you are asking as to what Furtwängler was doing also in the 30s, well, certainly it was very good, and it was Furtwängler, because it was him, and it was this time. And now you cannot have at all the same approach.
Soprano Gwyneth Jones, who sings Brunhilde in the telecast of The Ring, came to Bayreuth in 1966. She first sang Brunhilde in Wolfgang Wagner's 1970 production in the abstract style, a style which has become known as Neo-Bayreuth. From the beginning of the Centennial Ring, Gwyneth Jones was one of Chéreau's strongest supporters.
Chéreau, for my first entrance as Brunhilde, he wanted me to be a young, joyous teenager, full of fun, and playing games with Wotan. So I come running in, and the Hoya to hose, and throwing him off with the spear, and really, it's so wonderful, and it helps one in a way to sing the Hoya to hose with such zest and zip. Patrice came to it completely open. He'd never done The Ring before. He'd only seen The Ring here in Bayreuth, one performance. And so he was completely fresh and open for new ideas, and he looked into the text and he saw what was there, and he asked us to do everything that is in the text, which is, in my case, this wonderful warmth and love and joy and childish action in Siegfried, this wonderful excitement that we have, the lovers.
final performance of the Chéreau Ring in 1980 received 85 minutes of ovation and over 100 curtain calls, a record for Bayreuth. But at its premiere, the production had caused a scandal unique in the history of the theater. William Mann, music critic of the London Times, was a member of the audience that first stormy summer of the Chéreau Ring.
Chéreau chose to set the ring basically in the middle of the 19th century, the height of the Industrial Revolution, which was the period that Wagner was writing the work himself, and which Bernard Shaw, almost 100 years ago, in his book The Perfect Wagnerite, recognized as being the meaning of the ring. It was a myth about the evils of power and the lust for money.
Chéreau and designer Richard Peduzzi used the festival stage to remind audiences of the political and social history which has taken place since the writing and first performances of the Ring. They set the four operas in a shifting time period, beginning in the 1840s when Wagner began work on the cycle, and ending in the 1920s when the festival was in the hands of his son Siegfried. In Chéreau's retelling of this story, Wotan's castle is a pastiche of architectural styles. The Rhine maidens are prostitutes frolicking on a hydroelectric dam. Wotan and the other gods, dressed in brocades and laces, are bewigged, vain, and lazy. Hunding, dressed in the period of the Ring's premiere, looks like a wealthy mine owner. Gunther wears formal dinner clothes, and his half-brother Hagen a wrinkled business suit. Alberic and the Nibelungen live and work in a coal mine that looks like the basement of a big city tenement. And Siegfried forges his sword with a huge steam-driven drop hammer. Those who objected to this staging did not accept the premise of Chéreau's production, the Industrial Revolution's corruption of mankind. Nor did they understand the displacement of time he used as the framework for his approach. Yet the music and even the theater itself had caused hardly less of a stir a century earlier. Since Richard Wagner moved himself and his family to Bayreuth in the last century, artistic revolution and innovation have become part of the city's heritage. The first revolution was the building of this unique theater and the premiere here of the completed Ring cycle in 1876. The second came in 1951, when Wagner's grandsons, Wieland and Wolfgang, emptied the Bayreuth stage of its literal trappings and replaced them with abstract sets, subtle lighting, and stark movement. The third came in 1976, when Wolfgang turned to the team of Chéreau and Boulez in order to reset the theater's course.
When I first saw Chéreau's Ring, I was bowled over by a lot of things, but for me it was perhaps the most human ring I'd ever seen. It was certainly the funniest ring I've ever seen, certainly the wittiest ring, and also the cruelest ring I'd ever seen. And although it may have developed and certainly has changed over the last 5 years, working now on it and getting to know it even closer than then, I do realize that these qualities remain.
The operas of Richard Wagner were described in his day as the music of the future. This had to do as much with his original use of harmony and orchestration as it did with his individual writing for the voice and the extraordinary theories which form the basis of his operas. To Wagner, opera was more than a matter of music plus drama. It was a grand synthesis in which every aspect of a work and its production were welded into a single expressive unit. He was his own librettist. He was also a major conductor, and later became a stage director and lighting designer as well. Still, he wanted more control. He wanted a theater of his own, built to his own specifications. This dream became a pressing need with the creation of The Ring. Wagner based the cycle on ancient folk sagas, dealing with a massive power struggle between a race of subhumans called the Nibelungen and the gods high above them in Valhalla. The stakes were the universe itself. It was a struggle which ended in the destruction of both races. Wagner's unprecedented drama of gods and dragons, incest, greed, hate, and redeeming love came to life on a summer's evening in 1876. Wagner's disappointment with the productions was keen when he saw his gods strutting on stage before the first night audience as though at a costume party, and a trio of Rhine maidens so ornately gowned that any illusion of swimming was lost. The composer died in 1883. Only one ring was produced at Bayreuth during his lifetime. Despite its shortcomings, the production demonstrated the power and originality of the cycle and its music.
It's the greatest epic that any musician has put down on paper, and I think you could probably say that it's the greatest epic that any dramatist has ever got onto the stage. And as such, it's so big that it's susceptible to an endless number of interpretations. And all that any producer can hope to do is to highlight one particular relevant aspect of its universality. Patrice Chéreau has done that, I think, in this Bayreuth production.
Also auf, schichte den Hund, helft euch Namen, ihr wäre nicht genug. Zauberstab, Marsch, also werdet euch verkünden, das wir schaffen, und in die Schachteln, wie euch nicht faul, auf den Fersen folge ich euch nach.
In the summers following the production's premiere in 1976, Chéreau and Boulez gradually reworked and rethought aspects of their approach.
Den vierten Takt in 3/4 in der zweiten Szene, ganz am Anfang der zweiten Szene. Weil diese Artikulationen sind nicht zusammen in zur Zeit. 1, 2, 3. Ja, Papa, Papa. Ja, da. Nein, nicht zu früh. Sie haben 1, 2, 3, tagadadam, tagadadam. Ja. Ganz am letzten Sechzehntel, ja. Können wir nochmal dasselbe? 1, 2. Ja,
The orchestra began to
tagadadam,
understand Boulez's search for transparency and detail.
tam,
The
tagadadam.
singers and the audience began to sense the human and allegorical planes on which Chéreau was working.
Okay, good.
In the summer of 1980, when their production was given for the final time, it was recorded for television. The director was Brian Large.
No matter how many times you've seen the scores, no matter how many times you've taken them apart, you've still got to go back and look for fundamentals. It was necessary for Chéreau to trust me and for me to trust him. And it's also hard for him also to know what I'm seeing of his, and to know from his point of view what I'm going to translate that into. You've got to be able to be on the floor to see what it is that Chéreau is doing. I've got to be able to see, in a sense, from behind his head, through his eyes, what he is trying to get from the artist. So what I'm trying to do is to find out if I can build a series of pictures which will grow dramatically. After we've done rehearsal stages, I mean, there's a great deal of bookwork has to be done first. Everything that has been shouted at or thought about or discussed in rehearsal has to be put on paper. And when that's done, we then have a series of meetings with the cameramen so that they know what it is they're looking for and how best to achieve it.
Dan bij meer 6 en 70 is weg.
What I'm trying to do there is to get the best angle. I'm trying to get the best place to position a camera. I've got to find out whether I can actually get the most dramatic effect on a certain lens or angle. First camera rehearsal is always with piano. Well, hopefully we will have got something sensible out of it, and after a lot of consultation and discussion. Our next camera rehearsal will be with orchestra, and we go into our control room. That is our dress rehearsal on camera.
Ja, ja. So, 55 ist die 1.
So.
Ja, nein.
Und jetzt fallen weg 57,
Ja.
58, 59.
Ja.
And afterwards, we review that, make corrections, we try to polish what we can, and prepare ourselves for the next day when we have 2 recording sessions. When we record here, we record everything in acts. That means that the whole of Valkyrie 1 is a non-stop 61-minute take. There are no stops and starts. It is a performance, and hopefully the public, when they see this, will recognise it as a performance, as a live performance.
Okay, let's do it.
if we've actually come out with a single product, which I think we have, it's been achieved simply because we've had a partnership. There's been a sort of three-way partnership, which has been headed by Boulez. His musical tempi, his whole idea of the ring have dictated the style in many ways and the pacing of Chéreau's ring, and consequently my own attitude to the way that I've wanted to shoot it and treat it has been dictated by what Chéreau is doing, by what Boulez is doing, and the fact that we have had this marvellous three-part confrontation sometimes, but marvellous communication has actually helped to bring the whole thing to a good head.
The Chéreau production was a far cry from what the ring had come to mean early in Bayreuth's history. It was during the reign of Wagner's widow, Cosima, the daughter of Franz Liszt, that the first Bayreuth style was established. You have only to look at this famous photograph of Richard Wagner and his wife, she gazing with devotion at her lover and master, to realize that for Cosima, Bayreuth was a sacred trust, a heritage given into her keeping. For 2 years after Wagner's death, she could not find the strength to take up the festival's directorship, and only Wagner's production of Parsifal, his last opera, was given at Bayreuth. Gradually, Cosima emerged from her mourning and achieved Wagner's dream, presenting all of his operas at Bayreuth. She began in 1886 with Tristan and Isolde, then Meistersinger, Tannhäuser, Lohengrin, and The Flying Dutchman. In 1896, she also undertook a new mounting of the ring. Looking at the set and costume designs for this ring, it is obvious Cosima was attempting to preserve her husband's wishes and ideas while trying to improve upon the inadequacies of the first Bayreuth ring. The costumes, for example, were simplified and the use of color was more unified. The Rhine maidens were hung in harnesses to simulate swimming, and schoolboys on wooden horses represented the Valkyries riding through the air. In her zeal to reproduce her husband's wishes, Cosima imposed a rigid system of attitudes, actions, and reactions which were synchronized with the music. Soprano Lily Lehmann, who had been a Rhine maiden in the 1876 ring, writes in her biography that Cosima carried the everlasting standing in profile to the point of madness. When challenged on any of her changes, she would turn to her son Siegfried, who had only been 6 at the first Bayreuth ring. "You remember, do you not, that it was done this way in 1876? I believe you are right, Mama," Siegfried would reply. In 1907, at the age of 70, Cosima turned the directorship of the festival over to Siegfried. Some see him as a man who lived in the shadow of his father, between a domineering mother and a strong-willed wife, who took over the festival after his death. But Siegfried's achievements were significant. As his daughter Fridolin recalls,
So when my father burst upon the scene, first in '92 as an assistant to all the other assistants in very minor functions, he started on the lighting tower. And lighting was his great passion, as it of course was also Wieland's, the passion of his life. The evolution of the stage set, of course, is due, I think, to the constant improvement of the lighting equipment. In the old days, in the gaslight, and of course even more so in the candlelight eras, you had to use hangers. I mean, canvas which was painted, because the light source was so limited. So every few feet you had another hanger. Then as lights improved, the three-dimensional set came in. You built really things that you could stand upon. Well, the 1924 ring had a lot of hangovers from the pre-war ring. And it was only in 25 that my father started to build new sets. So this is naturally part of my father's contribution, because simply as the lighting and the technical equipment got more efficient, you were able to modernize everything and to do away with many of the old things.
In 1914, when Siegfried was 45, he met a young English girl of 17 named Winifred Williams. She was the adopted daughter of one of Richard Wagner's most ardent disciples. It almost seemed predestined that one day she would become Siegfried's bride. And indeed, they were married a year after their first meeting, just as World War I was beginning. As the conflict escalated, the Bayreuth Festival was shut down for a decade. Siegfried and Winifred started a family destined to become the next Bayreuth dynasty. Friedeland, born in 1918, Wieland in 1917, Wolfgang in 1919, and Verena in 1920. With the death of Siegfried, Winifred Wagner began what was to become one of the most controversial periods in the life of Bayreuth.
That when there is a cesura, like the death of one head of the festival, and in his place comes a 33-year-old beautiful young widow, that the old generation, of course, immediately predicts doom. Mother, of course, brought in Heinz Tietjen, the director of all the Prussian state theaters. He brought his team from Berlin, which was very convenient and very sensible. Heinz Tietjen brought Emil Pretorius, and they renewed the ring in 33. With them, they also brought an absolute genius of a technical director. It was a young team, and Paul Eberhardt, he really completely renewed everything backstage at the Festspielhaus. This was a period of naturalism.
Even with the technical improvements made by Winifred Wagner, Bayreuth became a theater without a profile, more the summer home of the Berlin Opera. Bayreuth also became a political symbol of the aspirations of Germany's new leader, Adolf Hitler. He had been a friend of Winifred since the early 20s, and during her tenure as head of the festival, the association between them deepened. Special guest quarters were constructed for the Führer adjacent to Wanfried, and shortly Bayreuth was transformed from a musical shrine into a Nazi shrine. The town was decked out during the festival with swastikas and flags. Hitler's appearances were greeted by fanatical cheering. When the conflict in Europe escalated into World War II, performances at Bayreuth were reserved for wounded military and for soldiers on leave. A ticket to Bayreuth became as prized a decoration as the Iron Cross. Despite intensive Allied raids throughout Germany, performances at Bayreuth managed to continue through 1944. By the next year, hostilities had ended, and in the bleak period following World War II, the connection between Hitler and Bayreuth returned to haunt the Wagner family.
As everybody knows, my mother went through a so-called denazification, and she got off with a minor degree because she had about 66 people testifying that she saved their lives. They really couldn't pin anything else on her except for her friendship with Hitler. Wieland and Wolfgang took over the festival after the war, and the first season was in 1951. Wieland, in the beginning, was in charge of all the artistic matters, and Wolfgang of the administration. From 1954 on, Wolfgang also, on occasion, alternated with Wieland in directing an opera. And but I mean, the real sort of revolution of the new Bayreuth came about at that time. Wieland swept everything off stage, and then of course he really started life as a painter, and so he really, instead of using sets and things, he used lighting to tremendous effect, and I think he was an unparalleled artist in that. I don't think there's anyone who ever quite matched his art.
In 1966, with the death of Wieland Wagner, his brother Wolfgang assumed the direction of the festival alone. A few years later, Wolfgang created a new ring cycle, which was an outgrowth and a refinement of his previous staging a decade earlier. As the centennial year of the festival approached, Wolfgang made the courageous decision to create a new and different sort of ring with Boulez and Chéreau.
Als ich vor der Frage stand, für das 100-jährige Jubiläum eine Neuinszenierung des Ringes in Szene zu setzen, war natürlich zwangsläufig die Frage gegeben, nach welcher Stilrichtung hin dieses Werk zu inszenieren wäre. Partitur und Text sind ja unveränderbare Vorgegebenheiten.
And of course one must never forget that Wagner said, Kinder schafft Neues. Children create new theatre, and Patrice has certainly done this. And the most exciting thing that I think about this ring is that after the premiere, and in fact even now, people are reading the text, they're having tremendous arguments about what is in the text and what is not in the text, and this is right, you see, he's done it right because it's all here in the text, and they have the most violent arguments. And I think it's wonderful because it really makes people think and creates a tremendous enthusiasm and make people go back to the text and study it, because of course that's what we're here for in Bayreuth, is to make the pieces live and make them actually, make them fit into our time. And this ring is a ring of our time.
Like Gwyneth Jones, Donald McIntyre, who sings Wotan, has been a part of the Chéreau production from its inception.
I had a marvelous experience with the ring here in Bayreuth because I came in the Wolfgang production. Now these two brothers, Wieland and Wolfgang, the grandsons of Richard Wagner, after the war they decided that the tradition had become so overlaid from years and years of performing that people had forgotten the real reasons. So they decided to take everything out of the ring to allow people to just really make up their own minds what this is about. And now Chéreau's come along and put it all back again, but not in the way that it was previously. It has been made possible because all this tradition that people don't understand the reason for it any longer has been dealt a fatal blow, and we can, or Chéreau was able to start afresh and to see what this ring, this great work of Wagner is all about.
The youngest member of the Chéreau ring cast was American soprano Janine Altmeyer, who sang the roles of Sieglinde and Gutrune, seen here in a coaching session with Boulez's assistant, conductor Jeffrey Tate.
Okay. I think I have something funny to do on the stage there.
You rush. Actually, you have a move. You have a move forward. The other thing is, I think the triple is a little bit without rhythm.
Oh yeah.
You make Weiser. It's somehow it needs to be ta 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 a little bit stronger.
More. Okay.
More marcato.
Yes.
Marcato. Marcato.
Oh, marcato. Okay.
Weiser mir schnell.
Ja.
Mit besorgter Hast.
Okay.
Waffenlos bin ich, dem wunden Gast wird dein Gatte nicht wehren.
That's a little bit too slow.
That's a bit too slow. If you can get the same marcato and more speed, die Wunden Weiser mir schnell.
Yes, I think that in Germany at the moment there's the public is very much divided about traditional Wagner and modern productions. Half of the people adore the new way of producing Wagner, and half of the people, especially older public, they don't like it at all. I think that the difference between the Chéreau ring and other rings that I have done is the fact that the people are much more alive, let's say. They aren't so godlike as in other rings. There's a lot of movement in this ring. We aren't opera singers in the traditional sense. We have to use our bodies as well as our voice in the Chéreau ring.
I thought it was impossible, for example, to work with the singers and to have and that the singers can act. But I discovered in the rehearsal it was possible. It was not only possible, but it was necessary to have this result. And that was very important to. And now I was in my element. I was in my domain. And not. It was not only opera. It was my work of theater.
Mother, of course, hated every moment of the Chéreau ring, and I must say that she hated a lot of Wieland's work too, because it wasn't, her generations and her own. And I told her many times that Chéreau was absolutely dying to meet Mother. And she said, oh no, she doesn't want to meet him. If he ever crossed her path, she would shoot him. So last year, Chéreau again approached me about meeting Mother, and I said, well, this is the big artists' party, this is our chance. And so when eventually, after I knew that Mother was well fed and had had some wine and was in a more benign mood, I said to Patrice, well, Patrice, are you ready to die? And he straightened his tie and said, yes, let's go, And so I took him over to Mother's, and I said, from sort of leaning over Mother, I said, Mother, even though you want to kill him, Chéreau insists on meeting you. And so Mother sort of bent down momentarily. And then she said, well, where is he? And I said, well, he's right behind you. And so with this, she turned round, and with all the charm, of course, she gave him her hand, and he kissed her hand, and he's a very handsome young fellow, and she took to handsome people always. And then she did, of course, stuck by her gun, let's say, not quite literally, But she did say, she said, you know, many times I felt like killing you. And then she turned around and then she said, but after all, isn't it better to be furious than to be bored?
It isn't difficult to understand why the old guard reacted so violently against Chéreau's production of The Ring. It made fun of cherished institutions, and among them the cherished institution of Holy German art, which is the Bayreuth Festspielhaus, and the works of Richard Wagner. But I think it was a valuable thing to have done, and it may prove to have started a new look at Wagner's works on the stage.
I hope we have created something which will help people to come to the Ring without fear or worry, to enjoy the Ring, to go further and to look at other productions of the Ring and then come back to this and see what it offers, because it's fresh, it's vital, it's original, it's down to earth. And if we've helped people to actually come as close to the Ring as that, then I think we would have succeeded.
Well, the future is what the next people will do. So, I mean, I'm not responsible for the future at all. So, I mean, I don't feel responsible at all. I was responsible for this production. As you say, I brought Chéreau in into this house. So I feel slightly responsible for the whole production. But I mean, if somebody else has other ideas, is highly welcome. And I suppose that's the better the ideas will be, the better it will be for the next audience. It will bring a scandal, it will be a shock, you never know.
In the summer of 1983, there will be a new ring at Bayreuth, commemorating the centennial of Wagner's death. The dramatic and musical course will be charted by stage director Sir Peter Hall and conductor Sir George Solti, both making their debuts at Bayreuth. They will find their justification in Wagner's music, just as Pierre Boulez and Patrice Chéreau did before them. For however the Ring is presented, it is the music which remains its bedrock, unchanging and ever renewing.